Okay. So you might get a prompt that says, um, it asks you to record. Okay. And we may have a couple other people coming in, which is great. So, obviously today we're going to talk about getting ready for med school interviews. It's about that time. So this is a very open conversation. So at any point, if you have a question or a thought, please feel free to bring it up. If for some reason I don't see your hand or anything like that, feel free to just chime in. That's totally fine. Like I said, this is meant to be a conversation, and it's helpful that there's 10 or so of you here so that you can also give each other suggestions and feedback as well. So I'm going to go ahead and start with my first slide here. So the interview timeline is the first thing we're going to start with. And this is probably the biggest question that Cindy and I get, is about what the interview timeline will look like. And I know that just the idea of the interview timeline can bring up a lot of stress for a lot of people, which I totally understand. And that's because what normally happens is the stress comes from hearing that other folks are getting interviews and you haven't gotten one yet, or something along those lines, or you haven't heard from the school you want yet. And the hard part is a lot of this timeline is just waiting. It's a really long period of time, so you could start getting interviews anytime now, and that can run all the way through the winter. Typically, you'll hear back from a lot of your schools by February, but even some interviews trickle in later than that. So that's a really long time. And people are going to get interviews at different points in time, and it's really school dependent. So AAMC does have a couple of resources if you're wanting to look up a little bit more about school timelines, but it's not always consistent what information they're going to offer you. But if you do want to use the MSAR tool again to look into school timelines, or the Choose Your Med School tool, those are two resources. What we hope you do is stay off of the unreliable resources like Reddit and others that can kind of increase your anxiety when someone comes on and says, like, I've had my interview at this place and you haven't had yours yet. Because again, they could be offering a certain amount of interviews a month, right? And so you don't even know what cycle you're in terms of that as well. So try not to let the process stress you out. We're going to talk a little bit about that later. But this is kind of the general timeline as we know it. Questions about that? Good. Okay. And let me know if you can't see my presentation moving forward. I've had presentations before where people don't say anything, and then I'm like stuck on the same slide. So let me know. Okay, so types of interviews. So typically your interviews are going to fall into 3 categories. So we have MMIs, the one-on-one interview, and group interviews. Group interviews seem to become more popular. I had a lot of students last year that had like a group interview in combination with an MMI or one-on-one interview. Every school, again, is different. They'll send you this information. Make sure you read it thoroughly. But usually you'll have one or a combination of these types of interviews. So just as a reminder, the MMI is the interview type that you have multiple short interview questions and you cycle around stations. Most of these are done virtually. I actually don't know any that are done in person right now. And this is the one that we're going to practice, right? That Cindy has set up the 4 different kind of sessions you can choose from to practice the MMIs. It's a great one to practice because it's probably pretty different than anything you've done before. It's like the speed dating of MMIs, and it can be hard if you don't practice to kind of figure out the timing and how that station type question asking is going to feel. So for this type of interview, I have heard a variety of lengths of time and amount of questions they ask. So again, hopefully that you're given this information in advance. Typically, it's like you get 1 to 2 minutes to think about how you're going to answer a question. So they'll propose the question, you'll be able to read it, and you'll have a little bit of time to think about it. right now, if you're thinking like, oh my gosh, that's not a lot of time to think about a question, I think it actually feels a little bit longer when you're in the moment. Plus, you'll have done all your prep work in advance. And then again, as far as how long you have to answer, it really varies based on school. Some places give you 5 minutes, some places give you 8, 10 minutes. I don't think I've heard more than 10 minutes, but it's possible. So you'll have some time to answer a question, and then you'll move on to the next station with the next person asking you the question. So we'll talk a little bit more about how to prepare for those, but that's the structure, and those tend to be pretty common these days, the MMI interviews. Just as common and still happening are the one-on-one traditional interviews, as we call them. People always get these. Sometimes you'll get them in combinations with the MMIs. And again, this is going to be very school specific, but you could be with an admissions committee member, a faculty member, or a clinician. It could be that they are able to see all of your application materials in advance. It could be closed file and they don't see any of your application materials in advance. It just depends on the school. Hopefully, again, they send you that beforehand, so you'll be able to prep for that. The great thing about a one-on-one interview is it tends to be more conversational, right? Where the MMIs are a little bit more transactional, but this allows you to kind of show your personality a little more and to actually gather some more information about the school and the person that is interviewing you. So again, this is probably one you will experience during the process. And then there's the group interview. So, like I said, lots of folks last year had group interviews, and they again varied on how they were run. But typically it has you with a group of applicants. So you're in a Zoom room with a bunch of other people, and you're either tackling a question they propose or a scenario or a problem to solve. And oftentimes they're just looking to see how you're working in a group, right? So remember, you're entering a teamwork type cohort med school environment. You're going to have to be working with these people, and they want to see how you do in that capacity. So really trying to see your interpersonal skills and to see kind of how you're able to solve a problem with the collaborative nature of the group. So that's the third kind of interview. We cannot predict which ones you'll get when, but hopefully you'll be prepared for all of them. And then in terms of how these interviews are going to take place, there's typically 4 types of formats. So there's live in person, which we know was really common before the pandemic, and then basically everything went virtual. And now some in-person interviews are kind of coming back. So in-person, virtual, which are still pretty much most common, hybrid. So again, this option of you can go in person if that's a possibility for you. And then asynchronous. So this is a little less common, but there are a few schools that do this where they have you record answers as part of the process and then submit those answers. So those are the types you might encounter. This is a big question we were getting last year, which is if it's optional. So if you get an interview invitation and they say you can choose, you can either do a virtual interview or you could do an in-person interview. What do you do, right? So obviously they're offering virtual interviews because they have to be equitable. They have to allow for people that can't, if you have to fly to their school or get themselves there, stay in a hotel, all the things that go along with an interview. So we say, like, if it's possible for you to go, let's say you are living in Boston and your interview is in Boston, right? Or somewhere very close within driving distance, then maybe it would make sense for you to go. There is an advantage to going and seeing yourself, what the program's like, what the campus is like, how the people are, and if you will fit there. I've been on some med school tours, and it's always so different, like hearing about the school versus going and walking through and seeing everything. It's really, it makes a big difference. And I think if you can go to an interview, you also are able to make that impression on, that group of people that is interviewing you. They're not allowed to be biased. So they'll say, you have an equal chance, virtual or in person. So if you cannot go, obviously don't go. Don't put yourself in financial strain to fly, across the country and go to an interview. So it's really just kind of up to you. And then if it's close enough, it makes sense for you to do so. Any questions so far, and kind of like what to expect in the type and format of interviews? Okay. All right, so we are going to get to preparing for your interview. So I kind of broke this up into 3 steps, although I think it can be broken up a lot of different ways. But just to simplify it, 3 things you want to do is gather information about the interview itself, review your application materials and the relevant school information, and then prepare how you want to answer the question. So we're going to go through those 3 steps. So the first thing you want to do is gather information about your interview. So schools will send you an email, and I have the friendly reminder to check your junk mail, as Cindy has told you, just in case it happens to go to junk or spam. But they will provide you with information, or they'll send you like an initial email, and then they'll say, we're going to give you more information soon, and then send a follow-up email. This is like one of the first questions I ask folks when I do mock interviews with them, because it is really important to understand, like, who are you interviewing with? Is there 1 or 2 people there? Is it an Emma? You want to know everything you can about these interviews. I'll show you later on. Student Doc Network does have some, like, they collect surveys from people that have been through the process and try to give you a little bit information. But you'll get the bulk of this information when you get the interview email. So see what they'll give you. It's also really interesting because some schools will give you a whole lot and some schools will give you bare minimum. So like some schools will tell you exactly what's going to happen, and other schools will, you kind of are going in blind. So it's very school specific. But try to find out the information that I have listed here. So the other way you're gathering information is we have this wonderful alum network at Wellesley. And so as soon as you get an interview, you're going to want to email Cindy and I. Just put us both on the email, because if one of us is out of the office, the other one has access to our little spreadsheet with all of our alums that have recently been through the interview process at the school that you have an interview with. So once you get that interview, you reach out to them, and they know you're going to reach out to them, and you can ask them about how was the interview process, what were you asked, kind of what went on, all of those things. And you can do that over the phone or over Zoom, whatever you all can coordinate. There are times where applicants send us an email and we don't have an alum at that school, and there's nothing we can kind of do there. But for the most part, we have enough alums now spread out that we usually have at least one that has been through the interview process. So we'll set you up with them. And that, I think, has been really helpful for applicants in the past. Okay, and then reviewing your own material. So this might seem pretty obvious, but if it's an open file interview, they're looking at everything, right? So if you have something on your application that you did a really long time ago, just be prepared to talk about that, right? So refresh yourself on the research you've done in the past that you haven't touched in forever, or something that you did first year that you wrote about an organization, a project. Just remind yourself of kind of everything that you have on there, kind of just a review of yourself. As you're doing that, one of the things you can do for yourself that will help in this interview process is outline some situations or examples that really highlight your skills. And we'll talk about this a little later, but we can't guess. Well, we can guess. We can't exactly know what interview questions they're going to ask you, right? So even if we go to Student Doc Network and it lists all these interview questions, you could have a different interviewer than someone, and they could really, or each time they could ask different questions. So we really can't predict it. What we can do to help you prep is think about what examples, what skills, what things you want to share, and have those outlined to pull those answers in those examples into different questions that they may apply to. So outlining some of those things in advance is incredibly helpful. And you can, just typing it out or writing it out as an outline. And then when you go to do your mock interview, practicing saying those examples aloud makes a big difference as well. So in addition to reviewing everything that you already submitted, reviewing the medical school information. So I know all of you have done this already. You chose your schools for a reason, but you want to brush up on this before a specific interview, because they will likely ask you, why here? Why this school? Why us? Right? So they want to know why you're interested in them. And so you probably already know that, but being able to talk about that is kind of different. You want to have a narrative a way to say that aloud to them, that you feel like gets your point across in the best possible way. So again, going back through school information. And another thing here is oftentimes Cindy and I will do the MMIs and happy to do prep interviews, but when you get a specific interview for a school, you're really excited about it. Let's do a mock interview just for that school so we can ask you questions about that specific school or have you answer why this school. That can be really helpful, and a lot of applicants do that. On a sidebar, just so you know, on Handshake, there's actually a specific like appointment type for mock interviews for these type of mock interviews, and it gives you an hour instead of a half an hour meeting time. So definitely select those when you're doing a mock interview, because if we're trying to kind of simulate what it's going to be like in your interview day, we want to have enough time to do that. So that's just a tip. And then of course we have practice, right? So, oops, I just tried to remove my chat box and it knocked me. So again, you want to try to outline how you're going to answer some of these major questions, right? And then take part in our mock interviews. People sometimes will say, how many mock interviews like should I take part in? It's really up to you. I mean, at least one MMI and one traditional is probably important. Some folks will do 5 mock interviews. Some will do, one before every actual interview. It's kind of open. I also often see applicants doing, they'll do one with us and then they'll do one with their mentor or PI or someone that they work with, just to kind of get like a variety of feedback on how they're doing. I think that's great. And the other idea, if you don't necessarily have an additional person to do a mock with, would be to record yourself on Zoom and just watch it back and see, even to pick up on the little things. Am I saying a lot? Am I looking at the camera? Does, those types of things. Am I fully answering the question? That can be helpful. When I do mock interviews one-on-one, I often will say, do you want me to record and send it to you? And you can say no. But some folks will say yes, because they want, to see themselves and how they're looking to someone else. So I think that can be helpful. Practice is really important. I can't emphasize that enough. It's interesting, like, because, especially when someone does a mock interview for the first time, they may have, I mean, you have, right? You've written about this so many places on your application. Now you're like deep in the secondaries where you're reflecting on everything you've ever done. And you're like, I know this stuff, right? I know this. But when you go to say it out loud, right, sometimes that's just the place that gets hung up for you. So doing the aloud practice is really important. So outside of your head, to me, to the mirror, to Zoom is a really important piece of this process. Just, talking to your roommate or parents about like the different experiences you've had, that will all be really helpful. And on the last note to that, practicing, the one thing you want to do is practice, of course, but we don't want to get to the point where it sounds like you're reading or you've rehearsed like a script and that's what you're saying. That's why we often encourage you to kind of write out an outline or bullet points, because you want to know these ideas, but you don't want to like have memorized like 3 sentences you want to say, and otherwise you'll come across kind of like inauthentic or robotic. You do still want to be like naturally answering questions, just having those ideas ready to go. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay. So responding to questions. So, obviously, you want to try to answer the question to the fullest. If you feel like you're kind of, as you're answering the question, you've lost track of what you're answering, it's always okay to pause and say, did I answer your question fully, or can you repeat the question one more time? That's happened often, and that's absolutely fine. That's kind of an easy thing to do. Don't be afraid to ask again. This second part here just talks about, or the second small bullet just talks about when you share past experiences, make sure you discuss a specific situation or task, actions you took, and outcomes of your action. So they're really looking for specific things and for you to provide a well-rounded answer. Again, it's going to be much more impactful if you can tell a story or a specific example rather than kind of stringing along a bunch of little examples or being really general, right? So just speaking in generalities doesn't really show anything about who you are or what you've done. It's kind of too much fluff, right? So you really want to get down to examples and to things that that you want to talk about in full. Be yourself is really important, right? So you want to be a fit with them, they want you to be a fit with them. So being your full authentic self is the best way to do it. Showing your personality through Zoom can be hard. That's why we practice, but try to like, if you're a smiler, smile, be yourself, like put that out there. Don't try to put on a show just for that day. If you're asked about a weakness or a struggle, or maybe there's like a gap in your application, it's not so much about that they were looking for you to explain that particular weakness or struggle, but they're looking for your reflection on it and what you've learned from it. So some people get really worried here that they're gonna like ask about something that they don't want to talk about, right? But if you focus on the reflection and what you've learned more than the actual issue, it feels a little bit more possible to answer that question. So that's just kind of another little tip there. These bottom two are don'ts. These actually came right from the AAMC. So obviously, just like you're writing, you don't want to provide patient information. It's just a reminder. I know sometimes as we talk, maybe we're not writing anymore, we're talking about something, we lose track of trying to be private with someone's information, but that's a really important piece for a doctor to have. So you could refer to the patient as a patient, but we don't want to give out any other characteristics or information that may distinguish them. And same with if you're talking about a situation or a colleague in a negative light, which we always like, me and Cindy try to pull you away from that anyways, but if you happen to need to share a situation in that regard, not providing any information about that could inform them who that might be. So I recently went to a conference for, there was a session on MMIs, and they talked about, not having to fill up all the space. And I think that's an important thing to share with you all, because usually, regardless of the Zoom conversation, there's awkward silence on Zoom. Think back to those COVID classes or any Zoom experiences. Like, it's common for there to be awkward silence, and you really have to get comfortable with that, because if you answer a question and it's fully and complete and you feel good about that, and you still have 2 minutes left in your MMI answer, you can stop. And that's absolutely fine. And the interviewers will feel fine about that as well. What you'll probably find is they'll ask you a follow-up question, just trying for more information. But you don't have to fill that silence. Oftentimes, if you feel that silence, that's when it gets a little weird, right? So all of a sudden you're mentioning something that you weren't even going to say at all, right? Or going too far in an answer where you should have stopped earlier. So do stop yourself, allow that awkward silence to be there. I say awkward silence, but it doesn't have to be awkward, right? Just allow that silence to be there, and then let the interviewer ask you more. Let them lead, let them continue the conversation. The best answers are complete, but also concise, right? So that's the thing we work on when we practice, is those nice, concise answers. All right, so virtual interview reminders. These are pretty self-explanatory. I feel like we know this, we just have to remind ourselves. Finding a quiet, clean space for your interview. One of the things that was interesting about the conference is people were sharing like examples of things that had happened, and you're always like, no one would ever do that. And then they're like, oh yes, so they would. So we have to put these on there, right? But one interesting story I heard from the conference was that one of the schools was just wanting to make sure that there was no one else in the person's room or space. And so they had them like turn the camera around to like show them the whole room. And I guess this person had a very clean like space behind them, but like under the desk, and the rest of it was like pretty big disaster. So I don't think that they're going to necessarily ask to see your space, but just kind of being prepared for things like that. They should tell you in advance in an email if they're going to do a room check, but they don't want other people in the room feeding you answers and things like that. So they may ask for you to move your camera and show them a different part of your space. So just kind of being prepared for things like that in your virtual interview. The other thing, again, this is something we take for granted, but testing our audio and video ahead of time is really important. I have had folks tell me their internet went out during an interview, and that's just, I think interviewers are understanding, but that just causes so much stress for you, and it does interrupt the flow of the interview. So test it. Even like getting on Zoom a half an hour before a virtual interview with a friend just to make sure, like, okay, I'm on. How's this look? How's my backgrounds? Like, are we good? That's a great test for yourself, talking to them, making sure that all of your tech works. Leaving your animals in another room. So although our furry friends are wonderful, it is disruptive to the interview. If you have a furry friend kind of walk across the screen, normally in a Zoom, love it, but in a interview session, you don't want anything possibly that could distract. Log on early and take a few deep breaths. We're going to talk about kind of breathing through some of our anxieties in a minute, but early is good, right? And then allowing yourself to kind of calm your heart rate and breathing as much as possible, because naturally you're going to be nervous. As a nerve-wracking process. That is normal, right? But giving yourself some grace when you're doing that. And then dressing professional from head to toe. So I think, again, this is interesting. Like, why do I have to dress professional when they're only going to see me from top up? So again, in case they happen to do a room check, but also just the idea that we want you to feel good. So professional means different for everyone. And certainly, like, you can ask me or Cindy if you're wondering about a certain outfit. I have people do that. But you want to feel like good on the outside, so you feel good on the inside, right? So if it's a power suit, you'll rock a power suit. If it's something else, absolutely wear that thing that makes you feel good. But just as you would go to an in-person interview, go to a virtual interview. It really makes a difference in how you feel. Okay. So I'll stop there. How we doing? Like, taking it all in? Any questions?
I had a question. Sorry for the music in the background. I'm in a public place, but so I had a question about, do you have any recommendations about like timing or scheduling interviews if you get multiple? And also my second question is, how much should or shouldn't you reference what you wrote before in like your primary or secondary application? And if you do reference it, should you indicate like, oh, I wrote about this, et cetera, et cetera?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those are really good questions. Thank you. Okay, so the question about timing. So that's a really interesting question. So if you do have some control over your interview schedule, giving yourself a break between interviews is definitely helpful. They are really exhausting. Applicants, will tell us sometimes, again, it's school dependent, but sometimes they could be a half day or a full day once you've gotten through everything. And that's because they'll have like an information session. They'll have, maybe you'll have this type of interview and then later have the group interview, but they are very mentally taxing, and you want space between interviews to rest and recover and also prep, right? So being able to prep for one and then stepping out of that mindset of that school and prepping for another is really helpful. So if you are able to give yourself space, I would do that. But there might not be as much flexibility. It kind of depends. Is that helpful in that regard?
Yes, and I'm actually not sure like what it looks like when they invite you to schedule an interview, but do you suggest like doing scheduling it within a week or
Hmm.
like more time, I guess, to prepare?
Yeah, that's a really good question too. So again, it's school specific. So they won't necessarily give you a lot of time maybe to schedule. It just really depends. They may give you a couple dates. And so I guess I would just do it based on kind of what you have going on in your life. And if you're able to fit it in at a time that's less stressful than other times, I think that's probably most important. Prep time, I mean, if a week's a short amount of time, that a week is plenty, right? Like when you're prepping for these interviews, you don't want to like overdo it either. You want enough time to just do like your reviews and then do a mock interview. So a week is plenty of time to do that. Um, if you schedule it out too far, you may put it off anyway, right? Until it gets a little bit closer. Also, it's kind of like daunting, right, to take it on. They sometimes give you options to do like like they'll have one group of MMIs in the morning, one in the afternoon. So sometimes you'll have flexibility on like time of day. So that's a thing to think about now. Like, when am I most focused? If they do give you a time of day option, obviously some people are morning people and some people like really thrive and their brain kind of turns on more in the afternoon. So that could be something to think about. It really just depends. But also paying attention to time zone differences as well. That's another good one to think about. But also if you're working, right, which I know a lot of you are, do you want to take the day off? That's another one. I know applicants in the past will take the full day off if they're interviewing, or do you want to take the day, like what can you do? Can you take the day before off? Like talk to your supervisor, PI, whomever now about the process and how you might want some time around interviews. Again, anything that you know will help reduce your stress level, I think is the best possible. And then what was the second part of your question? Because now I just went on a tangent.
No problem. It was how much should or shouldn't we reference what we wrote in the primaries, secondaries, and if we should indicate that we wrote about this in more detail if we do mention it.
Yes. Great question. So hopefully you'll know if it's open or closed file, right? So those ones are more obvious. So if someone has access to all of your application materials and secondaries, then you really don't need to reference a lot of that. You can obviously, if you answer a question that's similar to a secondary question or something in your primary, you can say something like, as you probably read in my primary application, or, you know, as I mentioned in my personal statement. So kind of referencing in that regard because you know they've seen everything. If they don't have access, then you don't have to really, you can kind of do it however you'd like, because this is the first time that they're hearing about any of these experiences that you've had. So you don't have to reference it. You can just say, you know, this is when I did this and this is when I did that, because they won't have seen any of that information. If it's unknown, which does sometimes happen too, like they just don't tell you, which is a little unfair. I think, again, you can go either way, but I think in that case, it kind of does make sense to mention it and say, you know, something that was in my application was that I'm really committed to service. Here is what in my example or so forth. If you don't know if they've read it or not, right? Because that way you're still referencing it, you're letting them know, you know, this is part of something you may have access to, but if not, then it doesn't do any harm either. So again, it really depends. When you get that school email, you know, fingers crossed, they'll let you know if it's open or closed file, so you kind of know how to reference the things you've done. But don't be too afraid to repeat either, I think, because again, like when someone's reading something versus someone is telling you something about it, you know what I mean? It does come off a little different and the details can feel a little different. Like I have that experience quite often where, you know, I'm working with someone on a personal statement or a secondary, and the way that it's written and the way that they talk about it is different, and it makes it sound a lot more like a story and interesting when you're talking about it. So you don't have to shy away from mentioning similar and same activities or referencing them again. I think that's fine, especially if they're important to your experiences. It's absolutely fine. Does that answer your question? Any follow-ups to that?
Yes, that was super helpful. Thank you.
Good. And I often get, oh, go ahead.
Sorry, I have a quick follow-up to that.
Sounds good.
But if it is an open file interview, is it safe to assume that they read everything thoroughly and they'll like know everything about my application?
No, but I mean, so in that case, they should have, right? That's the idea. But I guess more safe to say that they have like access to all of it, right? So, no, I don't think we can ever assume anything. But you'd like to think that that's part of their, you know, job on that committee, that they're kind of going through things. But no, I mean, I think you could still reference it in the way that you can give them the kind of full picture, just in case that they haven't seen it, but knowing that they can maybe go read more about it if they'd like to, I guess is something to kind of keep in your minds, that they have a reference where someone else might not.
Got it. Thank you so much.
Mhm. Oh, the last thing I was going to mention is folks often ask if it's okay to repeat answers, not necessarily answers, but like themes or bring in the same example with different interviewers or different people in an MMI. And typically that's fine. You know, if you're being asked a very similar question, to pull in an example with a different person is fine. If it's the same person, you want to try to pull a different example, but if it's different person in a different MMI room, or if it's a group interview, then an individual interview, and it really is the answer to the question, it's okay to use a same example. All right. So for the sake of time, I'll probably keep going because I love that we're getting to some good questions. For those of you that haven't heard of the 7-11 breathing, the whole idea behind the science is that your out breath needs to be longer than your in breath. So counting to 7 as you breathe in, and then counting to 11 when you breathe out, just allows for that process to happen. Some of you may have practiced this before. You know, what you'll find on interview day is that the majority of you will be really nervous. Your heart rate will increase, your anxieties will be there. So again, sitting in your space and giving yourself time, if you feel comfortable closing your eyes, if not, of course, leaving them open, and doing some 7-11 breathing can be really helpful in just calming down your nervous system. That's the whole idea behind it, is it if you do it for a few minutes, it will really start to calm down everything. And I think that can help put you in a better headspace starting off. So this video is really short and really helpful. So I will share this presentation. And so you can, of course, just look it up as well. Even play something like this before you start, a short meditation, something that will put you in a really good headspace for this. Or of course, if there's something else that works for you, you know, doing that as well. Okay. So again, some of this may seem common sense, but we definitely want to make sure we go over some of the little things about virtual interviewing. Position of the camera is pretty important. So the picture down here with the woman in the red sweater. So although this seems pretty straightforward, I Zoom all the time and I see all sorts of angles of people's face. So I don't think everyone always thinks about it. It does make a difference. So adjusting your computer, right? If you need to stack it up on a couple books or whatever you need so that your face is in line with your camera, I think makes a difference. And you might have to test that, of course, to see what you look like by turning on your Zoom screen. Lighting also makes a difference, bigger than you would think. So in the picture with a purple background, this person is backlit in the first, right? So if you have a window behind you, it kind of shades your face. Whereas if you have a light in front of your computer, it brightens your face. And why is that important? You know, just when you're answering questions, they're able to see you better, right? And so it just kind of comes across a little bit more clear. And I think that this picture is a good indication of that. Other things to think about is like right now I can see all your names, right? So when I see your face, your name is at the bottom. I think I circled this, guys, here. Just how do you want that to appear? Do you want to have your pronouns? You don't have to, but kind of like looking at how do I have my title? Do I want to change my title in any way, knowing that they're going to be able to see kind of how I have myself listed? So it looks like he has his name, but this person here actually has their email as their title. I don't have a preference to give you. I mean, I probably would go with your name just because they're going to be asking you questions and it's nice for them to reference your name. But it's really up to you and how you kind of want to present yourself. But just know that that exists. And also, of course, like if you happen to turn your camera off, your picture that you have up comes on. So some of you right now don't have pictures, so your name just comes up. But if you do have a picture, just knowing what that picture is and making sure it's something professional that you like and you wanted to be there. Okay, so those are some, oh, and then be prepared for the unexpected. So heaven forbid our internet goes out, right? Or something weird happens. You do want to have a backup device ready. So even if that's your phone, an iPad, a borrowed something, just have something with you on interview day, because if something happens, being able to at least log back on with your phone, even if it's not the best picture, and say like, I'm sorry that happened. Should we reschedule? How do you want to move forward? That's an important piece. You don't want to lose them altogether. So having a backup plan before you start can kind of take down some of those anxieties. The other thing I just like, if you have multiple people on a screen, I think it's kind of nice to look at like different people's backgrounds and see like what you like that people did, what, you know, do you want a plain background? Do you want to have something behind you? My biggest tip is like nothing distracting, right? So nothing super distracting that will just kind of, they'll keep looking at that instead of you. Otherwise, you know, you know, it's pretty much kind of up to you. But these are all things you can practice and look at yourself and decide kind of that everything's looking good. Okay, and then usually at some point in your interview, you'll have the opportunity to ask questions yourself, which this is actually a big piece that sometimes you all forget about because you get nervous about what they're going to ask you, but you're actually learning about this school as well. You're learning if you like the people and their curriculum and all of that. So AAMC actually has quite a bit of questions to get you started about what you might ask. So I screenshotted a couple here. So things about evaluations, financial aid, I think top ones about curriculum. But I always, when I do mock interviews, have people prepare what they might ask, because either it'll come up naturally, right? So you're having a conversation with someone and they start talking about your curriculum, and then you say, oh yeah, I was wondering about this, or I was wondering about that. Or at the end of an interview, they may just say to you, what questions do you have for us? And you don't want to go completely silent then. You want to have some questions to show the interest in the school. So best if they're school and program specific. So you kind of have to make them again as you go. But the AAMC again here has some really great questions to get you started. Okay, and then after each of your interviews, we encourage you to take a couple notes about how it went, right? Especially in the beginning, like this is a long process. You don't want to forget how things went. And like I just mentioned, you want this to be a match for you as well as the medical school. So honestly, I have had people come back and say, I actually wouldn't want to be at that school based on my interview experience. It's rare, but it's happened and it's totally valid. Like whatever happened in that interview that gave them the bad vibes, you know, listen to that. And answering the last question here, would that person have been happy at that medical school for at least 4 years? Probably not. And I think that's a valuable thing to get out of an interview. So just, you know, or you may have one that was okay at first and you're like, okay, that was good. But then you have one that you absolutely like, you just felt like you fit with those people and that place. You want to know the difference between those two if you get offers from both schools, right? So take a couple notes, take a little bit of time to reflect if you have it before moving forward. And then Student Doctor Network. So again, this is information that they collect from folks that have done interviews at these schools. You know, it's self answered information. So like we have to kind of look at it, but also take it with a grain of salt and make sure you get your clear information from your email from your school. But there's a lot of information if you look, if you literally can just Google your school, Student Doctor Network, and interviews, and it has tons of stuff on there. It also has sample questions, but again, those are hard because you just don't know what the person in front of you is going to ask. But some of this other information you might find helpful. What one did I screenshot? I think this is Tufts. But where did the interview take place? This one is the style of the interview. So they did mostly one-on-one. Was it open file or closed file? So that's, again, like if they don't give you that information, maybe look on Student Doctor and see. How long was the interviews? Pretty much varied quite a bit, but there's a lot more out there than this as well. So I know people go there for Student Doctor Network for other resources, but it can be helpful in interviewing. Again, you just have to be careful to not like take it as, you know, that this is exactly what's going to happen in your experience. It's what's happened in past years. It's what's happened with the people that have responded to Student Doctor Network, but certainly not everyone probably has had the experience. So kind of tread lightly with that, but use it as a resource, certainly. Okay, the dreaded denial that we have to talk about. So it was important for us to talk about receiving denials today because they come up quickly and they can be jarring, right? So the important thing to know is that even the most successful applicants in medical school get more denials than acceptances, right? And even worse than that, denials can come out before acceptances, which can make it really hard. So specifically, BU and Georgetown send out denials early. So if those schools are on your list, they send denials right away. And we tend to see students get like really upset about those, like, why did I get denied first? And this is like, but that is actually a common part of the process. And eventually it'll feel a bit more normalized for you to get those. But it's also very valid to be very disappointed and take the time and space you need when you get those denials. There's nothing really for you to do at that point other than just process that information and kind of move forward, knowing that it's really likely that you're going to get an interview and an acceptance somewhere else, right? So Wellesley students have a great track record. We have great numbers of folks getting into medical school. So you just kind of have to hold on to the confidence that you're doing all the right things. Cindy and I are happy to meet with you and kind of debrief about a denial, especially if it was like something like your dream school and you're just feeling really down. Like that's something we can definitely do with you. But I just wanted to put this there so that you know that you're probably going to get a denial sooner than later and that it's coming. And how can you mentally prepare yourself, just kind of knowing that it's coming and everyone's getting them will be part of the process. This is another reason why we tell you to stay off like Reddit, is because the braggers will brag, but like you don't usually see people getting on there being like, I just got denied from my 5th school, you know? So like, just know that like you're gonna see people bragging way more often than you're gonna see people talking about their denials, and just kind of keeping that in mind throughout the process. All right, so this is like my conclusion slide. So I want to open it up to more questions, but the big takeaways, this is a really long process. I know a lot of you are working in school, staying busy, and that's what I would encourage you to do, because just waiting is really going to increase your anxiety because it is such a long interview season. But we are here for you throughout the process as much as you need. So taking care of yourself is really important. Keeping your support system close. So if your support system is your family or your friends or your partner or whomever, you know, letting them know this is the part of the process I'm in, and it's going to be stressful. I might reach out to you for a little bit more support, to grab a coffee, to you know, do what I need to do during this time. And then of course, meeting with us is hopefully you will do. It's an important part of the puzzle as well. Okay, what questions did I not answer that we still need to know? Think of anything that anyone wants to share that they've kind of heard about the process or they think might be helpful for other applicants to hear?
I have a random question that popped up.
Sure.
And I guess the question is, in your experience, what would you say is the part of the interview or an interview question type that people get the most tripped up on, or that they, fixate on?
That's a really good question. So it's different for everyone, but so I'll give you like kind of 2 answers, just in a generally speaking, like in a one-on-one interview. I think people have a harder time answering like the vague questions than the very specific ones, like tell me about yourself, for example, or why do you want to be a doctor, or why do you want to go to Tufts? Because they are so vague that if you haven't thought about like how you might structure that in your head in advance, you could just kind of word vomit for 5 minutes, right? So I think those can be really hard for people. That's why like it's important again to prep and try to like think about, if someone were to ask me, why do I want to be a doctor? What are 3 points I would want to say? What are 3 things I would want to get across to them? So those vague questions are hard. And it's likely you're probably going to feel like one of the questions during your interview process you didn't answer well. That's very common. You probably did better than you think, but that's okay too, right? To have one question that you felt a little off, but the other ones were okay. So hopefully that validates a little bit. And then, sometimes people get tripped up on MMI questions that are like ethical. So MMIs are a little tricky. You'll see if you're doing the practice, like you'll often get a scenario. And some schools are heavier on scenarios than not, but a lot of it has to do with like ethical. How are you going to react in a scenario with a patient? They want to see like how you communicate bedside manner with a patient. So more of those like very specific like scenario situations can be hard for folks because that's not something that everyone's practiced. Some of you I know are, working in hospital settings, but some folks aren't. So if you're put in a scenario where we have one during the MMIs where someone's like actually pretending to be a patient and there's an issue. And so being able to react to that, I think could sometimes be hard for people as well. Those are the two that come to mind, but it also may be very personal, right? Depending on what you do and do not like to talk about.
For sure. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Not to hog the time,
Okay.
but I guess another question would just be for those MMIs when it is a situation that you're thrown into and you're essentially like role playing with somebody,
Yes.
do you ever address the person themselves or do you go into it immediately and say, hi, good morning, are you so and so patient?
Like address the actual person, not the
Yeah.
Good question. So usually what will happen, so you'll get the prompt with the scenario in it and you will go into the scenario as the doctor and they are the patient. So no, you would just treat them like the patient. Yes. You'll probably know by the prompt. But yeah, you usually just go right in. It is like an actual scenario where you're pretending to be a doctor. So you want to like go full force into your acting abilities.
Understood.
Yeah. Yeah. And sometimes there's ethical questions like, we probably did some of these in your mock interviews with your back advisor about like teen pregnancy or, ethical issues around maybe hot topics, abortion, things like that. You may have some of those things come up. Sometimes in MMIs, I've heard schools ask about current events and stuff going on in the medical field. So again, if you do thorough prep, making sure you're looking up kind of what's going on in the news, if there's anything or any like hot topics in medicine or health, which during your interview time, there will be an election. So there will probably be lots of them. I'm trying to think that, yeah, if you're signing up for the MMIs, you're going to experience all of this. So that's a really good part of it is you'll kind of get to see what that process is all about.
I love it. I'm excited. Thank you so much, Lainey. And I just wanted to say good luck to everybody. It is so comforting seeing familiar names and faces. So good luck,
Good.
everybody. You got this.
Yeah, for sure. You do. Any other questions? Good questions. Oh, got one in the chat. Brogan said you too. Great. Well, I'll stay on a minute if anyone wants to stay. Like I said, just reach out to us. Feel free to schedule those mock interviews on Handshake. Select that one specifically so that you can get the hour chunk. That's a good thing to know. And then again, reaching out early to like your mentors and folks and letting them know what stage you are in the process, just so when it comes up, if you want to do a mock interview with anybody else, you'll have some folks ready to help. All right, I'm going to stop sharing and try to stop recording. And you all have a good rest of your night.